So I know we're running a little bit behind. Luckily, I talk really fast, so I might finish soon, and we'll get you guys on the break shortly. So as Jen said, I'm Jessica, and I'm a second-year student in the Integrative Conservation and Ecology program, and today I'll be talking about the socio-ecological trade-offs for freshwater management in Yunque National Forest, Puerto Rico. Some of you may have seen this talk before, so I apologize, but anyways, here we go. So just a bit of background about my study site. I do work in Puerto Rico. It's an island in the Caribbean near Haiti, sort of. And specifically, I focus on the northeastern corner of Puerto Rico, which is where Yunque National Forest is located. And as you can see, it's made up of several different watersheds, which drain the water that falls into these headlands down to the ocean. And it's a really interesting system. It is managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and it's the only tropical forest that has that distinction. Its main industry is tourism. Over 1 million visitors come a year to this forest, and 20% of Puerto Rico's water supply actually originates within the forest. And so, as you can imagine, it's in the tropics, so there's no snow, so the rainfall is really what's providing this water supply. And as we know, it's very variable through time. So what people have done, both in the forest and throughout the island, is build dams. So within the actual national forest, there are several intakes. So there's 34 dams. Some of them are represented here, and all of the dams are associated with intakes. And so when I say dams, I'm talking about low-head dams, which are usually less than 5 meters. And there are larger dams throughout the island, but these are really what's found within the national forest. And so you can imagine this is really important, so we have a constant water supply, but it also has impacts on the system as well. And one of the ways these dams impact the system is through reducing connectivity, which we've heard a lot about. So we're going to hear another definition. Hydrologic connectivity is impacted. So the definition of hydrologic connectivity that I use is the water-mediated transfer of matter, energy, or organisms between the streams and the ocean. So when I talk about connectivity, I talk about it on a barrier-to-barrier basis. So for example, here on the left, you have a dam, and it's considered to have high longitudinal connectivity. So there's 4 different directions of connectivity, and the way that dams typically influence it is longitudinal, which is just in a line. So here you can see that there's a lot of water coming into the dam, and then a lot of water flowing beyond the dam down into the ocean. So that would be considered having high connectivity. Whereas on the right side, a lower longitudinal connectivity is observed because you have a lot of water coming into the dam and then not a lot of water going beyond it. So there's a reduction of the connectivity, and again, that can have some ecological impacts as well. So for my dissertation, these are the objectives that I'm thinking about focusing. I don't have any data yet, so please give me feedback on my ideas. So first of all, I want to look at how does longitudinal connectivity vary from 1970 to 2015 in Yunque. Does longitudinal connectivity change when you look at different migratory species, because there are different migratory organisms within this aquatic system? And then also, is it possible, and I'd like to recommend dams to be targeted for future removal based on socio-ecological factors? So we'll get right into the first question. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of different, there's connectivity impacts the ecosystem. And one of the major ways is it hurts these migratory organisms. So shrimp have been studied very heavily in Yunque ever since 1988, when it became a long-term ecological research site. And they have this really cool life cycle that's very similar to salmon. So it starts off with the adults living in the headwaters, and they release larvae that passively drift within the river down to the ocean. And so then they spend about 50 to 100 days developing the ocean until they become juveniles, where they actually locate a source of fresh water coming into the ocean, and they can actually climb back up into these rivers. And so because they've adapted in this Caribbean system where there's lots of waterfalls, they can climb over any barrier as long as there's water flowing over it, which is really cool. So you can actually see them crawling along the shore if you look at, or crawling along the shore of the river if you look at certain times, typically during the night. And then as adults, they find a nice pool where they live out the rest of their lives. And some species have been found to live over 10 years in some cases. So similar to salmon, but the difference is they don't have to go back to where they were born, and they also don't die after they make that journey. So we know that these shrimp are important, and we know that it's tied to the water budget. So in 1994 and in 2007, a water budget was developed for Yunque. And so you can see with the rainfall coming in, 60% of that becomes runoff. And out of that runoff, only 47% was making it to the ocean in 1994. The rest of that is being taken for community use, more social reasons. And then in 2004, the study was done again, and only 30% is actually making it to the ocean, and the rest is being taken off. And so when they're removing this water from the river, you can imagine they're also taking out the larvae, and they're reducing that connectivity for these shrimp to survive, and that has impacts on the ecosystem. So what I hope to do, the budget can be taken into an index of connectivity. So you can convert kind of the probability of a shrimp moving below a barrier and then also back up a barrier to give you an idea of what the connectivity is at that one barrier. So what goes into the probability of a larvae reaching the ocean, which is probability of downstream movement, it's really just focused on how much water is being removed at that barrier. And then looking at the probability that a shrimp actually can move back over the barrier, what's really important is the amount of time that the flow going over the barrier is higher than the amount that's being withdrawn. So those are two factors, and you can multiply them together and get an index of connectivity at one barrier and then combine them for the entire watershed and look at what's really happening based on water withdrawal within this watershed and how that can impact shrimp connectivity. So doing this, we can do this for all the different watersheds in El Yunque and hopefully get something that looks like this, where on the x-axis you would have the year, and on this y-axis you would have the index of longitudinal riverine connectivity, which is what I was talking about on the previous slide. And what I expect to find is that connectivity has been decreasing through time. So you started off with maybe almost 100% connectivity, and then it sort of falls down as you move through time. And this isn't real data, this is made up data, but probably what's likely is that Espiritu Santo, which has a lot of major withdrawal sites on it, is probably decreasing a lot faster than, say, the Mamayas, which was a wild scenic river for a long time, and connectivity was intact. So something like this, where we can see which watersheds are being the most impacted by withdrawals and during which time frame like these decreases are happening. So moving on to my second question, does longitudinal connectivity change when you look at different migratory species? So that index, as you may remember, was just focused on shrimp survival, but there are lots of other organisms in this system that also have that migratory life cycle where they have to connect to the ocean and then go back up to live out their life. So some of these species are the American eel, mountain mullet, the Puerto Rican goby, and snails. And so what's interesting is that all these different species have their connectivity or their movement impacted in different ways. So for the American eel and the mountain mullet, they don't climb up the water, they actually jump. So they can jump over barriers, but they have to be less than 5 meters. And some of them even are limited by heights shorter than that. Like if they're smaller, they can't jump as high. So that's a difference between the shrimp, which, as I mentioned, they can climb over anything as long as there's water. Even waterfalls that are like 100 feet tall, they can climb as long as there's water. And then the same with Puerto Rican goby. They have a modified pectoral fin on their stomach that they can use as a suction and sort of suck up the waterfalls. And they can get over barriers 32 meters. So anything above that, they're limited, but that's pretty high for a goby. And then snails, they're not really limited by height, they're limited more by flow speed. So because of their shape, they can't really get into currents that are flowing really fast. So all of these different organisms need that connection to the ocean, but their connectivity varies in different ways than the shrimp. So hopefully, again, made up data, but what I'm hoping to see is that connectivity will change depending on which species you're looking at. And so here, again, we have the year, and on the y-axis, we have the index of longitudinal riverine connectivity, and so you see it be decreasing through time. And we expect, so things like the eel that are limited by that 5 meters, it's probably dropping off a lot faster. And so that'll, again, will have impacts on the community within this ecosystem. So that's something I also plan to look at as well. And then finally, I'm going to try to recommend dams to be targeted for future removal based on different factors. So I've been talking a lot about the impacts of dams and how it's bad for connectivity at times. But even though they reduce connectivity, I mean, they provide lots of different services. Even within the forest, there are different dams that provide hydroelectric power. There are dams, as I mentioned, that have this freshwater provision. So this is where the water gets sucked in and converted. But also a really big service that they provide is recreation. There's no real natural lakes on the island. So when you put a barrier, all this water gets trapped in, and it makes a nice little pool of really cold water up in the headlands. So you can see people here barbecuing on top of the intake. So these dams also provide other services besides just water. And so my plan is to look at these dams and see what sort of services they're providing and make a graph something like this, where now on the x-axis you have the index of longitudinal riverine connectivity, And so like a 1 would be completely connected, water can flow no problem. A 0 would be no connectivity beyond that barrier. And then here on the y-axis, the amount of water withdrawn per day, and then also different sizes of the circle to indicate what the recreation use is of that dam. So maybe looking at this dam, you would say, well, it's having huge impact on connectivity. We're not getting a lot of water. We should take it out. But if you look and see that people are going there every weekend, they may not be happy if we suggest you remove that dam. So maybe we look at this dam where it's also impacting connectivity highly, not getting a lot of water from it, and people aren't really using it. So sort of just including those social factors. There are other ones, I'm sure, that besides recreation use that will come into play also, but that's just an example of a social aspect I'd like to look at. And so sort of to conclude, I expect to find that connectivity is likely decreasing through time. Connectivity probably varies with migratory organisms, which is an important step because as of late we've been focusing mostly on shrimp movement and not really looking at other organisms, and looking at both how connectivity varies depending on whether you look at waterfalls or dams within the system as well. And then also some dams should probably be removed due to the impact on connectivity and the lack of services provided. And so here, this is a picture in El Yunque. In the summer, you can see a lot of visitors really rely on this fresh water, the cleanness. And so the part of the reason it's so clean is because of these communities that exist because of connectivity. And so the broader implications, again, hoping for a win-win where we get the ecological community somewhat intact and also getting services we need from freshwater. But then also this framework could be applied to other tropical islands. Islands such as Hawaii and Guam have similar communities where the migratory life cycle of many organisms needs to happen, and also water needs as well. So, and with that, I would like to thank people on my committee, the Forest Service, and my lab for listening to this talk several times, and ICON. Thanks. Should we just go to a break since we're running a little late? Okay. You can.
One comment or question. So when we deal with the threats of dams, there's really two threats posed by dams. And one is their presence, but the other is their operations. So it just strikes me you could add a wrinkle to make this more complex, which is how do you, if you can manage the flow regimes, you might be able to keep the dam, but do stuff that would benefit certain species at certain times and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great option. And I'm also working, hopefully, with like looking at the social side institutions. And if we were going to do that, which string would we pull, and who would we talk to, like the state or the water district? But yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you. Should we go? How many dams in the forest? 34. And several throughout the island, but.